Welcome to the Word on Fire show. I'm Joseph Glore, your host, and this particular week, Bishop Barron is not with us in the studio, as he's been in Rome alongside his fellow newly ordained bishops for what he calls Baby Bishop School. So while he's away, we're going to share with you a talk that Bishop Barron gave at Duke University. It may actually be my favorite talk he's ever given. Over the course of this hour-long talk, Bishop answers questions about faith, science, philosophy, and theology by drawing upon the supreme rationality of the Catholic tradition and the Church's fundamental intellectual claim, namely, that Jesus Christ, the Word made flesh, is the icon according to which we understand the nature of all reality. Normally, I'd tell you to sit back and relax, but perhaps for this talk, you're best off buckling your seatbelt, because this one shakes the wheels right off many of the common secular claims against God. Enjoy the first half now, and next week we'll have for you the second half of this amazing talk.
God bless you all. Thank you for that warm reception. My Father Mike, thank you for that nice introduction. It is my first time to Duke. I've been in this part of the country a few times before, but never to the great Duke University, and very much enjoyed my stroll through campus today. Yesterday, I gave two talks at Father Scott McHugh's parish. Now, that's in the country of the other team, which will not be mentioned here. But now I'm in Duke territory, so I'll be very careful about that. But good to be with you. Thank you for having me. You know, this morning when we walked over, we made a beeline to the famous chapel, which I wanted to see. And I was very intrigued. Of course, I love the Gothic churches in France, which I came to know well. And, of course, you walk in this chapel, it looks like you're walking into Chartres. But the front door with the figures around it intrigued me right away. Because I recognized Luther pretty immediately. And then there's a colonial figure, it's Thomas Jefferson. But then there was Savonarola, which surprised me. There's a Savonarola revival going on within Catholicism right now. A lot of Catholics getting interested again in this figure, which I guess the fathers and mothers of Duke thought was a prototype of the Reformation, but a lot of Catholics are getting interested in him. But the one that really intrigued me was Robert E. Lee is there on the facade. And I'll tell you, what it triggered in my mind was something that I had been thinking about sharing with you. Part of Robert E. Lee's genius as a military tactician was he knew how to seize the high ground. Lee, in the early years of the Civil War, even though he was greatly outnumbered usually, would seize the high ground, dig in, and force the Union to come at him, which gave him a huge advantage. That's a metaphor I've been using for some years, actually, for a problem we face as Catholics or as Christians in this wider culture. Since roughly the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, what secular modernity has done is they've seized the high ground. They've dug in and forced us to come up the hill. Prove that you're rational. Prove that you make sense. We're setting the terms. Now you come up and satisfy our demands. In fact, early on when we were planning for this trip, I gave a talk at the Divinity School earlier, and one of the topics proposed was, does the Christian faith make sense in the secular academy? And I said, no, I'm not going to talk about that. That's Robert E. Lee stuff. I'm not going to go charging up their hill. I'm not going to say secular modernity sets the tone for the church. In fact, I'm going to argue the university came up out of the church. The church came first. As John Paul said, the university came ex corde ecclesiae, came from the heart of the church. I'm the very inadequate representative of the oldest intellectual tradition in the West. Ambrose, Augustine, Chrysostom, Jerome, Anselm, Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, Ignatius, John Henry Newman, John Paul II, and I got to prove that I'm sufficiently rational? I mean, I think rationality of the church should be taken for granted. And in fact, I would argue the secular academy ought to prove to us that it's sufficiently rational. So I want to take Robert E. Lee and sort of turn things around. I don't think we should go charging up the hill of the secular academy as though that sets the tone. We should make no apologies for the rationality of our tradition. So that's point one, inspired by looking at the Duke Chapel this morning. Here's my basic point, everybody. Jesus, the Word made flesh, is the icon according to which we understand the nature of reality. Oh, Jesus is a distant figure, ethical teacher, inspiring moral figure. If that's all he is, the heck with him. The Christian claim is far more maximal than that. The Word, the Logos, the pattern, if you want. The pattern of the divine mind by which the whole of the universe has been created has become flesh, and now we can see him. Think of those apostolic testimonies as the word of life, which we saw with our eyes and touched with our hand. The icon became visible, and that's the pattern according to which we see all of reality. You know, I don't know if you read the New Yorker magazine. I get the New Yorker largely for the cartoons, which I love because, you know, they're clever and they're funny, and usually I get them, but occasionally there'll be a cartoon that I don't get. And I bring it down to a friend of mine, Father John Lodge, who also reads the New Yorker and is kind of a wag, and then he'll explain to me why that cartoon is funny. And here's why I'm bringing it up, is John doesn't point out to me anything I had not seen in the cartoon, nothing I had missed in the caption. What he points out, though, is that mysterious, elusive thing called the pattern. When you get a joke, it's a very mysterious thing. I mean, you see everything, you read the caption, you understand it, but you don't get it because the pattern hasn't emerged. Wittgenstein, the great 20th century philosopher, said the most puzzling issue in all of philosophy is how to see something as something. It's very interesting, isn't it? We see things, but then we see them as something. That means we get the pattern. Here's the maximal Christian claim, that Jesus is the pattern, the logos. He's the reasonability by which we get the world. That without him, the world remains opaque to us. No matter how clever we are in the various disciplines, no matter how much we learn in the various fields, without him, we don't get it. Turn it around. Jesus is a kind of epistemic trump, if I can put it that way. Meaning, no view of the world can finally trump him, can outmaneuver him. He's the logos by which we understand the world. Now, mind you, under that logos, capital lambda, there's all kinds of smaller logoi. Think of all the different disciplines. The Catholic imagination has always been very hospitable to a wide variety of perspectives, viewpoints, disciplines. Think of the great Saint Bonaventure, a Franciscan master from the Middle Ages, who saw Christ as the center of all the other disciplines. Good. All the logoi make sense in relation to him who is the logos. So that's, if you want to put it this way, a sort of challenging claim I make first. I'm not going to go charging up the hill of secular modernity. At the same time, I hope it's an inviting claim. It's a generous claim that all the logoi of the world can find their relation to him. G.K. Chesterton, a great hero of mine, said that the church is the trysting place of all the truths in the world. That's the generous quality of the Catholic intellectual tradition. Okay? How about this, from the scriptures, that Jesus is the icon, we hear Paul say, the image, the icon of the invisible God, in whom all things in heaven and earth were created, in whom all things hold together. There's the maximalism I'm talking about. He's the lens, he's the pattern. Here's Hans Urs von Balthasar. Christ is the unchangeably valid blueprint in every situation in the world and in history. That's the Christian claim. If that's not the case, then the first verse of John's Gospel is wrong. That's the Christian claim. Okay, what I want to do now in the course of this presentation is to specify this by looking at 4 applications of this idea, 4 consequences of the view that Jesus is the lens. And let me lay them out to you first, and I'll go through them one by one. First of all, Jesus teaches us about God's non-competitive transcendence. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Secondly, the icon of Jesus teaches us a radical humanism. Third, the icon of Jesus teaches us everything we need to know about creation ex nihilo. And finally, the icon of Jesus reveals to us the dynamics of the Paschal mystery. And I'm going to argue those 4 things help to illumine the way we see all of reality. Okay, that's the program I'll be following tonight. If you're keeping score, we got those 4 things I'll be moving through. So, First of all, the non-competitive transcendence of God. The most fundamental Christian claim is that Jesus of Nazareth is also God. Jesus of Nazareth is divine. The Council of Chalcedon caught this paradox when it said, in Jesus, two natures, divine and human, come together without mixing, mingling, or confusion in the unity of one person. That's the ancient claim. In Jesus' person come together two natures, divine and human, without mixing, mingling, or confusion. And you say, well, that's a lot of old-fashioned, Greek theological language. It has an extraordinary implication. Let me explain why. In saying this, the Council of Chalcedon held off three options. One option, very lively in the ancient church, monophysitism, that Jesus is God and his humanity is sort of an afterthought. Monophysis, one nature, he's divine. Chalcedon said no to that. On the other extreme, Nestorianism, very popular today, by the way, that Jesus is like a super saint. He's a human person with a very intense relationship to God. Chalcedon said no to that. There was also a middle position, very popular at the time, the Arian position, that Jesus is a little bit divine and a little bit human. He's a mixture of the two, like a demigod. Think here of the ancient Greek and Roman myths. Think of a Hercules or Achilles, semi-divine, semi-human. Watch how Chalcedon says no to monophysitism, no to Nestorianism, and no to Arianism. What does it claim? Weirdly, strangely, intriguingly, Jesus is fully human and fully divine. The two natures coming together without mixing, mingling, or confusion. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that God is very strange. It tells us the God we're talking about is not a finite or limited nature. That God is not one being among many, even the highest being. How come? Because the beings of the world always relate to each other in a competitive or mutually exclusive way. You can't come up here and take my place without supplanting me. I could turn this podium into ash by burning it. The antelope could become a lion, but only by being devoured, right? There's a competitiveness among finite natures, a mutual exclusivity. But then again, listen to Chalcedon. In Jesus, divinity and humanity come together, but without competition, without mixing, mingling, confusion, without one supplanting the other. What does that entail? It has to entail that God is not one of the finite natures in the world. Not one being among many, not even the supreme being. Why? Because the supreme being would be in competition with another finite being. Which is why our great tradition speaks of God not as ens summum, highest being. What's the highest being? I don't know, Jupiter or something, or a seraph. I don't know, the highest being, the biggest thing around. That's what God isn't. Rather, following Thomas Aquinas, our tradition speaks of God as ipsum esse subsistens, the subsistent act of to be itself. Not a being, but being itself. Think here of St. Anselm. We know Anselm from the ontological argument, if we know of him today. Anselm says, God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, right? And you say, well, sure, he means the supreme being. There's us and things higher than us and up, and then the highest thing, that must be God. But think about it for a second. God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. If God were simply a supreme being, then God plus the rest of beings would be greater than God alone, right? If God were like Zeus or Jupiter, some high being, then Jupiter plus the world is greater than Jupiter alone. But that can't be true. God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. God is strangely other, uniquely other. Catherine Tanner, the contemporary theologian, says that God is otherly other, meaning his transcendence is a strange transcendence. In my language, God is non-competitively transcendent to the world. His very otherness making possible the most intimate connection. Now here I'll quote St. Augustine. Augustine said, the true God is intimior intimo meo et superior sumo meo. God is closer to me than I am to myself and higher than anything I can imagine. Is God in this room? Well, no, of course not. This room is made up of beings exclusively. All of us, the wall, the ceiling. This room is full of beings. God's not in this room. God is totaliter aliter, we say, right? Totally other. But is God in this room? Yes, because ipsum esse, the sheer act of being itself, is the ground of everything in this room. Intimimor intimor meo et superior sumo meo. That's the strangeness of God, the non-competitive transcendence of God. Look how the Bible catches this. The prophet Isaiah, as high as the heavens are above the earth, so high are my thoughts above your thoughts, and my ways above your ways. And a few verses earlier, could a mother forget her baby? Even if she forgets, I will never forget my own. I have carved you in the palm of my hand. What reality can be simultaneously superior sumo meo et intimior intimo meo, but the God who is ipsum esse, non-competitively transcendent to the world? Here's an image now that catches this, I think. Moses on Mount Sinai. He sees a bush that's on fire but not consumed. And from that bush comes eventually the name of God. If people ask me, what's your name? What will I tell them? And God responds, I am who I am. One way to read that is, stop asking me stupid questions. You know, I mean, which one are you? Which being are you? See? I am who I am. I'm not this or that. I'm not here or there, up or down. I am is my name. But now watch the image, see, that catches this philosophical idea. The burning bush. The bush that has become luminous and radiant and beautiful and is not consumed. When the true God comes close, we are enhanced and rendered luminous, and we are not consumed. Contrast that, by the way, to the ancient myths. In the Greek and Roman myths, when the gods break into human affairs, what happens? People are incinerated. Things have to give way as this bullying, competitive divinity crashes in. Then look at this biblical image. The closer the true God gets, the more radiant and luminous the world becomes. Do you see how the incarnation is simply the fullest expression of this dynamic? There's the way the true God exists. I'm going to come back to it a little bit because so much of the atheism, old and new, is predicated upon the assumption that God is a threat to human flourishing. Can I argue, please, everybody, emphatically, that's utterly unbiblical. They got that idea from a very poor presentation of the Christian faith. Because the true God of the Bible is the one who is precisely non-competitive with human flourishing. Okay, point number 2, still reading off the icon of Jesus. Radical humanism. I argue that no ideology, no philosophy, no religion has ever proposed a more profound humanism than classical Christianity. Why do I say that? I say it with this patristic adage in mind. You hear it in all the fathers. Deus fit homo, ut homo fieret Deus. That means God became human, that humans might become God. It's an adage repeated by all the church fathers as a way of explaining the essence of Christianity. God became one of us. So there's the familiar, the incarnation. But why? So that we might become God, that we might be deified by this contact. And again, I'll stand by this. I don't know any ideology, religion, philosophy that ever makes a bolder claim for us human beings than that. God became one of us that we might become deified, divinized. Now, let me just develop this by narrowing the focus a little bit, and again staying with an early controversy in the life of the church. Just a few centuries after the Council of Chalcedon, which gave us this non-competitive transcendence, there was a great argument over, I know it sounds very arcane, an argument over how many wills there are in Jesus. It's called the monothelite controversy. That just means one will. Because the claim was being made that in Jesus there's one will, divine. He's got the divine will which totally governs his whole person. But the Orthodox tradition, think of Maximus of the Confessor here, said, no, there are two wills in Jesus, divine and human. Because again, the logic of Chalcedon, he's fully divine and fully human. So don't say his human will has been eliminated or overwhelmed by the divine will. There are two wills in him, both divine and human. That means, look, in Jesus there's a play between an infinite freedom and a finite freedom. And in fact, the infinite freedom of his divine will is what grounds and enables the finite freedom of his human will. Now, how come I bring up this ancient controversy? Because go back now to the beginning of the modern period. So many of the modern philosophers are preoccupied with the issue of freedom, right? Think of, liberté for the French. I saw Thomas Jefferson on the facade of the Duke Chapel. Freedom. Don't tread on me. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. I follow my own path. You want to make it Americans' eyes, water with tears, talk about freedom, right? You hear it so much in the rhetoric today. Think of Kant here, maybe the greatest of the modern philosophers, whose supreme value was autonomy. Autonomy. To overcome heteronomy, law coming from outside. Kant wants to ground the moral life in the autonomy of the will, throwing off the shackles of oppressive society and ultimately an oppressive church. Think here out in the 18th century, deism beguiled the greatest minds of the time, someone like Thomas Jefferson. What was so attractive about deism? This view that, there's a God, but he's distant, out there somewhere way back at the beginning, the clockmaker of the universe. What was so attractive was the deist God left us alone. I could be free without the fussy interference of a distant God. Take a further step. Once you distantiate God and you say he has nothing to do with my freedom, finally, let's just get rid of God altogether. Why don't we just say we have no need of God? In fact, even the very idea of God is oppressive to my autonomy. Now, whom do you get? You get the great atheists of the 19th century. Think here of Ludwig Feuerbach, the father of modern atheism. God is nothing but a neurotic projection of my idealized self-consciousness. Stop kneeling down and begging this fantasy of your mind. Get rid of God, and you'll become fully whom you're meant to be. That's why Feuerbach says, the no to God is the yes to man. See, with that little phrase, by the way, he sets the tone for atheism from his time through Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. They repeat the same arguments over and over again. The no to God is the yes to man. One of his young disciples was Karl Marx, who was such an ardent follower of Feuerbach. He said, everyone should be baptized in the Feuerbach. It means the brook of fire in German. So we should all be baptized in the Feuerbach. Then Marx took a second step. How come we engage in this weird neurotic projection? Well, because our lives economically are so unhappy. Why do we invent religion? Famously as an opium of the people. It's a drug that we take to dull our sensitivity to the suffering that is caused by a bad and unjust economic system. Take another step now, early 20th century. Sigmund Freud also races down the Feuerbach autobahn, if you want. His famous Future of an Illusion, a title that pretty much gives away the game, Religion is a waking dream. It's a fantasy. Oh, how I'd love there to be perfect justice. I know there isn't, but I dream of it. I'd love there to be perfect fulfillment. There never will be, but I dream of it. Religion is that waking dream. But until we wake up, Freud said, we will not realize who we are meant to be. The no to God, to this fantasy, is the yes to man. Take one more step now in the middle of the 20th century. You come to Jean-Paul Sartre. Read his little book, Existentialism is a Humanism. It's the best expression, I think, of this trajectory, running from Feuerbach up to him. Here's Sartre's pithy and logical syllogism. Sartre says, if God exists, I cannot be free. But I am free. Therefore, God does not exist. That's how he summed up his existentialism. Now, do you see what's haunting Sartre? And it starts with Feuerbach. God is necessarily a threat to my freedom. God, if he exists, broods competitively over my freedom. Therefore, if I want to be free, indeed if I am free, I must dismiss God. Can I suggest to you, everybody, the answer to this trajectory from Feuerbach to Sartre is the monothelite controversy. The affirmation by the Orthodox faith that in Jesus there are two wills, not one. Notice, please, how his divine will does not negate or supplant or deny his human will. But in fact, his human will, like the burning bush, comes fully to itself precisely in relation to the divine will. That ancient theological controversy is the answer to this trajectory from Feuerbach to Sartre.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this week's episode of the Word on Fire show. Like I said, we'll be back next week for the second installment of this talk on faith and the Catholic intellectual tradition. In the meantime, go to askbishopbarron.com, where you can easily record any questions that you have after following along here. And of course, visit wordonfireshow.com for links to additional resources straight from Bishop Barron, including our new Pivotal Players DVD series. Thanks again for tuning in. We love it when you join us here for the Word on Fire show.